Rain on the Strand. Past 11. The last of the season's carriages having long since retreated behind bolted doors, and Miss Eleanor Paget stood at the foot of the steps to number 14, with water soaking through the left heel of her boot, and a pressed leaf of copper beech still folded inside her coat pocket, where it had lived for 6 months. She had not planned to stand still. She had planned to knock, to speak clearly, to hand the letter to whoever opened the door, and then return to the hackney she had not yet paid. What she had not planned for was the footman's face, the careful blankness that fell over it when he saw her, the particular courtesy with which a well-trained household manages an embarrassment, and the words that followed, said with practiced regret, which amounted to this: the Earl was not receiving. "I am not calling," Eleanor said. "I am delivering a letter. His lordship is not receiving correspondence this evening, miss." She looked at him. He looked at her. They had met before. His name was Perkins, and he had once carried a tray of warm milk up to the schoolroom when the boy could not sleep. And Eleanor had thanked him in a way that made him nod twice, instead of once. None of that was visible in his face now. She was simply a woman on the steps in the rain, and the door was simply a door. She was standing in the street when she saw the light shift in an upper window. She did not look up immediately. She heard the faint sound of a sash raised, the cold air making a current between the houses, and only then did she raise her face. There was a lamp behind the window, and a figure behind the lamp, and the figure had gone very still in the way she remembered. The quality of stillness particular to Edmund Ravenscroft, Earl of Ashmore, was different from the stillness of other men in that it was not passive, but concentrated. It was the stillness of a man who had decided to observe before he acted. She knew the difference now. She had not, once. His hand came up and made one flat, brief gesture at the glass. She could not read it for certain at that distance, and in that rain. She waited. The door opened again. Perkins stood aside. The letter was in her left hand. The pressed leaf was in her right coat pocket, the fabric worn thin at that corner from 6 months of the same small contact. She had not told herself she was carrying it. She had simply reached into her coat on the mail coach from Bath and found it there, and she had not moved it. She went inside. The entrance hall smelled of beeswax and coal smoke, and something she recognized without being able to name, the particular compound of a house she had lived inside for 2 years and left in a single cold morning. She stood on the mat, while Perkins took her coat, and did not look at her face, and she held the letter in both hands now, because there was no longer a pocket to hold it in. This is the kind of return that does not announce itself with any certainty. If you have stayed this long, you know that already. Stay a little longer. The Earl of Ashmore came down the stairs. He was not dressed for company. He was in shirt sleeves and a dark waistcoat, his cravat loosened, and he looked exactly as he had always looked, which was like a man carrying a weight he had declined to put down, the weight having eventually arranged itself into the lines of his face and the set of his shoulders and the way his eyes moved when he entered a room, which was twice as fast as other men's, and twice as still when they settled. They settled on Eleanor. He did not say her name, he said. "You should not have come." "No," she agreed. "I know." She held up the letter. "But you need to read this tonight." He looked at her for a long moment, and then at the letter. And then he came the rest of the way down the stairs and took it from her hand. His fingers did not touch hers. She was aware of this in the way she was always aware of what his body did and did not do, which was as information arriving before her mind had formed a question to receive it. He carried the letter to the light and broke the seal without asking her anything further, and Eleanor stood on the mat with her wet boot and her empty hands, and she waited. 6 months was not very long, and it was very long. It depended, Eleanor had found, on what you were waiting for, and whether you were waiting at all. She had not been waiting. She had been working, which was the appropriate response to a situation that required no patience, because there was nothing to be patient for. The letter of dismissal had arrived on a Thursday in late April, delivered by the steward rather than the post, which she had understood to mean it was deliberate rather than accidental. 4 sentences. Her services had been entirely satisfactory. The household's arrangements were changing. A bank draft for 3 months' salary had been enclosed. She was wished every good fortune. She had read it twice, which was once more than it deserved, and then she had folded it and placed it in the back of her traveling case and packed the rest of her things in the methodical way she had learned to pack after 8 years of going from one house to another. She did not linger over anything. She did not forget anything. She did not allow herself to ask why. She had asked why, of course. That was the defect of a mind trained in precision and honest observation. The why had followed her to Bath and sat across from her at the breakfast table of Mrs. Cartwright's house, the widow who required a companion for mornings and afternoons, and any occasion involving stairs. The why had offered itself in various arrangements, and none of them flattering. She was not accomplished enough for a permanent post. She was too direct in her opinions. She had presumed. In some small, invisible way she could not identify. And the Earl had noticed, and that was that. She was the governess he pensioned off, which was what Mrs. Alderton said at a card party in the 2nd week of September. In a drawing-room full of women who knew Lady Wells, and therefore knew the house at Ashmore, and therefore knew that the Earl had let his governess go in the spring. Mrs. Alderton said it kindly, in the soft particular way of women delivering information they believe will hurt, and who have decided this is for the best. "Are you not the young woman from Ashmore? The governess he pensioned off?" She said it in the middle of a sentence about the difficulty of good help, and the sentence had continued before Eleanor could answer. Eleanor had smiled and said nothing, and left the card party at the first reasonable opportunity. She had walked the long way back to Mrs. Cartwright's house, and stood for a moment at the Pulteney Bridge looking at the Avon, and telling herself, clearly and without sentiment, that she did not grieve for what had not been hers to grieve for. She had believed she was doing rather well until the misdirected letter arrived. It had come addressed to Mrs. Cartwright's house in the last week of October, sent by some confusion of similar addresses to Mrs. Cartwright rather than to its actual recipient, a Lady Cavendish staying in the next crescent. Eleanor had been the one to begin opening it before she saw the name on the outer leaf, and she had stopped at that point, and held it, and read only what was already visible through the partially broken seal. What was already visible was a single paragraph about a debt instrument and a set of warrants for a named lord, and the lord named was Edmund Ravenscroft, and the name of the woman directing the action was Dorothea Wells. Eleanor had sat down. She had sat for a long time. She had thought about what a woman of sense and proportion would do, which was to reseal the letter with Mrs. Cartwright's wax and return it with a note of correction, and go on about her mornings and afternoons and occasions involving stairs. Then she had thought about what she knew of Lady Wells, which was not very much, and what she knew of the Earl of Ashmore, which was a great deal, and what she knew of herself, which was that she was precise in her observations and inconvenient in her honesty, and had been sent away from the only house that had ever felt, against her better judgment, like something she was allowed to want. She had bought a seat on the Thursday mail coach. She had reached into her coat pocket in the cold Midlands dark and found the pressed leaf there. The copper beech from the library at Ashmore, where she had been reading one afternoon when Edmund Ravenscroft had stopped in the doorway and looked at her for a moment longer than was required to determine that the room was occupied, and then walked in anyway. She had pressed the leaf when he left, which she had told herself was a habit, and not a memorial. She stood in his entrance hall now with the letter in his hands, and she waited to learn whether she had made a mistake. He read it twice. She knew because she counted the length of the silence, and it was too long for once. "Sit down," he said, without looking up. "I'm quite comfortable standing." "Miss Paget." He did look up then. The lamp caught the gray in his hair, which was recent. 6 months of it. "Sit down." She sat. He folded the letter precisely in thirds and placed it on the desk, and then stood with his hands flat on the surface and looked at it for a moment before he looked at her. His face in lamplight was the face she had memorized without meaning to over 2 years of proximity and careful self-management, and it was giving her what it usually gave her, which was information in physical form with no verbal annotation provided. The jaw was set. The eyes had gone to their particular dark that she associated with decisions already made. "Where did you obtain this?" he said. She told him about the misdirected address and Mrs. Cartwright's wax and the mail coach. She told it briefly, which was her habit, and she watched him listen, which was his habit, and the room was very quiet. "The writ of attachment they are describing," he said when she had finished. "They intend to present it at Cavendish's dinner on Friday." "I assumed so. Lady Wells will be there." "She will." He was quiet for a moment. "And what did you imagine I would do with this information, Miss Paget?" It was a reasonable question, and she had prepared for it. "I imagined you would engage your solicitor this evening and have the instrument's validity assessed before Friday morning. I imagined you would then take whatever action your solicitor advised." She paused. "I did not imagine you would need further direction." Something moved across his face. She was not able to identify it immediately. It was gone before she could name it, replaced by the flat, severe arrangement that she had once believed meant she had said something wrong and had gradually come to understand meant something else entirely. He crossed to the fire and stood with his back to her and said, "You came from Bath tonight?" "Yes." "In the rain?" "There was a roof on the coach." "Miss Paget." His voice was very low. She heard him draw a breath. "Why?" She thought about giving him the practical answer, which was that she had the letter and he needed it. She thought about giving him the honest answer, which was complicated and possibly unforgivable in its honesty. She gave him the practical answer. He turned from the fire. His eyes held her for a long moment, and she looked back, because she had learned that looking away was a habit of people who believed they had done something wrong, and she had not done anything wrong. "You should not have made this journey alone," he said. "There was no one else available to make it. The post exists. Lady Wells's correspondence are thorough. I did not trust the post with this particular document." He looked at the letter. He looked at her. He moved, in 3 even strides, to the door and opened it and spoke a few words into the hall. Then he returned to the desk and picked up the letter again, and this time, when she watched his face, she saw what she had not seen before, which was that the tension in it was not severity. It was something older and worse than severity. Perkins appeared in the doorway, and Edmund said, "Tell Fane I need him. Tonight, if he can be reached." Perkins went. The door remained open. A draft moved along the floor. Eleanor became aware, without looking, that Edmund had positioned himself between her and the open door. It was a small thing. It had happened without ceremony and without announcement, and she could have explained it as nothing at all. A man standing in a room, a door in a room. She felt the warmth of it in her wrists before she had constructed the explanation. "You will stay here tonight," he said. "That would be highly irregular. The green room is prepared. It is never prepared. I have Mrs. Holt prepare it every week," he said, and then seemed to understand he had said too much because he looked away. A muscle moved in his jaw. He set the letter back on the desk. "It is prepared," he said again, as though the first statement had not occurred. Eleanor looked at the letter on the desk and said nothing. The pressed leaf was upstairs in the coat Perkins had taken. She thought of it there, and she thought of what it meant that the green room was prepared every week. And she told herself, precisely and without sentiment, that she was not yet permitted to know what any of it meant. She found Thomas in the morning. He was in the corridor outside the library, sitting with his back against the wall and a book open across his knees, and he was 9 years old and the Earl's ward, and he had not changed except that he was taller, which seemed unfair given that everything else had contracted in 6 months. He looked up at Eleanor and said, "You came back," with the directness of children who have not yet learned to make room for complicated feelings by pretending they are simpler ones. "I came back," Eleanor agreed, and sat down on the floor beside him, which she had always been willing to do, and which had been, she thought, one of the things the Earl had found acceptable about her presence in his house. She was not the sort of governess who required furniture. Thomas showed her what he was reading, which was a natural history, and she told him what she knew about the creature on the plate, which was a reasonable amount. And they sat together in the corridor for 20 minutes. And it was the most comfortable 20 minutes she had had since April. She did not know Edmund was in the library until she heard the particular silence on the other side of the door, which was a silence with a different quality from an empty room. She had learned to hear the difference. When Thomas grew cold and went in search of breakfast, Eleanor stood and turned and found the library door not fully closed. She said through the gap, "You might come out, my lord." There was a pause. The door opened. "You heard me explain the nervous system of the sea creature," she said. "I heard you tell Thomas that courage means returning to frightening places." She had said that. She had not intended it to mean what it meant, and she had entirely intended it to mean what it meant. And both of those things were true simultaneously, which was not comfortable. "I was explaining natural history," she said. "Yes," he said. His face was doing the thing again. "You were." He would have said something further, she thought, but the knock at the front door came before he could. And it was the kind of knock that does not ask. Lady Dorothea Wells was a woman of 62 who had survived 4 decades of the marriage market by understanding that confidence, correctly applied, was indistinguishable from authority. She wore black that was expensive enough to mean mourning as a choice rather than an obligation, and she came into Edmund's front hall as though she had been expected. She took in Eleanor in one brief sweep, from the plain morning dress to the shoes that had dried imperfectly from the previous night's rain. Then she looked at Edmund. "Your old governess, my lord," she said, in the tone of a woman reading from a list. "How unfortunate she has returned to embarrass you." Edmund said nothing. His stillness was complete and cold. "Miss Paget," Lady Wells continued, "I believe you were comprehensively released from this household in the spring. I imagine the Earl did not intend to extend an invitation." "Miss Paget is a guest in my house," Edmund said. "She arrived last evening." "How charming," Lady Wells said, which meant the opposite. She moved past Eleanor as though she were a piece of furniture left in an inconvenient position, and she settled into the drawing room with the efficiency of someone who considers sitting down in another person's house an act of possession. "I have come to discuss Friday's arrangements." Edmund followed her. At the drawing room door, he looked back at Eleanor, and the look was very brief and contained a great deal that he did not intend to convey, and conveyed anyway. Eleanor went upstairs. Mrs. Holt was in the corridor outside the green room, finding tasks to perform in the vicinity of the guest she had not expected, but had apparently been ready to receive for some time. She was 60 and thin, and she had been at Ashmore since Edmund's father's time, and she looked at Eleanor with the careful pleasure of a woman who does not permit herself the luxury of visible relief. "You came back," she said, which was the second time that morning someone in this house had said that. And the second time, it had not sounded like a question. "Briefly," Eleanor said. "I have some business to complete." Mrs. Holt looked at her for a moment. "The green room was kept up," she said carefully. "In case." Eleanor did not ask in case of what. She was afraid she knew. She went into the green room and sat in the chair by the window, and through the floor she could hear the low, particular sound of Lady Wells's voice arranging things, and she pressed her hand to her coat pocket before she remembered her coat was downstairs and the leaf was in it, and she was not yet permitted to need a leaf from another person's library. The solicitor arrived at 2:30. Eleanor knew because she could hear the stair from the green room, and Mr. Tobias Fane's step was a specific one, careful on the descent as a man who had been climbing stairs in great houses his whole professional life and had learned to treat each step as a form of courtesy. She had seen him twice at Ashmore in 2 years, always on the periphery, always carrying papers he did not show to anyone. She had registered him then as she registered everything, which was precisely and without deciding what it meant. She went down at 3 when the voices had stopped and the door had opened and closed, and she found Edmund in the study with the letter open on the desk and a second document beside it. Both of them weighted with the particular density of things that have been known for some time and are only now being said aloud. He did not look up. "Fane confirms it. The instrument is fabricated, but the fabrication is clean, and it will hold for the 72 hours she needs." "What does she need 72 hours for?" "My brother's name." He was quiet. "There is a record from the war, a charge that was not fully resolved. Wells has held it for 11 years. She intends to present it Friday evening alongside the attachment, so that any defense I make looks like a man protecting a guilty family." Eleanor sat down. She did not say anything immediately, because the thing she wanted to say required her to first understand it correctly. "Your brother," she said finally. "Is he guilty?" "No." Edmund's voice was flat. "He is dead. He has been dead for 9 years. The charge was constructed from a transaction taken out of its context by a man who owed Wells a favor, and by the time Charles could have rebutted it, he was gone. He pressed his fingers to the bridge of his nose. She has used it twice. Once against a man in Derbyshire. Once against—" He stopped. "Against Clara," Eleanor said quietly. He was very still. "Your wife," Eleanor said. "She discovered something. And Wells used the same instrument against your household then." He turned toward the window. The afternoon light was flat and autumnal, the kind of light that reduces everything to its correct proportions, and in it he looked exactly as tired as he was, which was entirely. "Clara found the original transfer document," he said, "in my father's papers. She did not understand what it was, but she understood it was significant, and she mentioned it to a woman at a dinner who was in Wells's confidence. 2 weeks later, she was in a carriage on the Taunton Road." His voice did not change. "The coachman survived. He said the wheel had been interfered with." She had understood, in some abstract and partial way, that his wound was specific and earned. She had not understood its name until now. She sat very still and let the silence do what silence does, which is to make room for grief that has been living in a house without anyone offering it a chair. He had sent her away because she had been using the library. He had sent her away because she had been reading there every Tuesday morning, beside his father's legal correspondence, and Wells's people had been watching the house, and he had understood what happened to women in his orbit who got too close to the wrong papers. He had said nothing, because saying it meant explaining Clara, and explaining Clara meant opening a door he had spent 5 years keeping shut. Perhaps you have stayed, because you already know where this is going. Forgive her for taking a little longer than you have. He was still at the window, and she sat in her chair. And the room held both of them with a kind of patience it had accumulated over several years, of the same two people being in the same spaces and saying rather less than the spaces required. The green room has been kept up every week, Eleanor said. Yes, he said. She looked at her hands. The pressed leaf was in her coat pocket on the hook by the study door, where she had hung it that morning, and she was aware of it there with a physical specificity that she recognized as the body knowing something the mind has not yet written down. I did not understand, she said carefully, why you sent me away. I should tell you that I understand it now. He turned from the window. His face was open in a way she had not seen before, the mask not fully in place, the decision to be seen not yet made, but the decision to stop hiding already arrived. He looked at her for a long moment, and she looked back, and the room was very quiet, and neither of them said anything further, because they had said enough for this moment, and they both knew it. Lord Cavendish's house on Friday evening was everything the season demanded, and nothing Eleanor would have chosen, but she had not been given a choice in the matter. Edmund had told her on Thursday that she would accompany him. She had told him this was inadvisable. He had looked at her in the level, unhurried way of a man who has already arrived at his conclusion and said, I know what Wells plans. I need a witness who cannot be purchased. And Eleanor had understood that this was not an invitation. It was one of his commands, in the form of a statement of fact. She wore the blue silk, which was the best she had, and she was aware throughout the arrival and the dinner and the first hour of conversation afterward that she was the plainest woman in the room, and that this was being registered and catalogued by a significant number of its occupants. Miss Cecily Vane was present, which Eleanor had expected. Miss Vane was 22 and fair-haired, and wore diamonds that had belonged to the Wells family for 3 generations, and she moved through the room with the confidence of a woman who has been told all her life that she is the correct answer to every question a room might pose. She had looked at Eleanor once, briefly, with a particular flat curiosity. Lady Wells waited. She was patient in the way of people who have planned carefully and are certain of their timing, and Eleanor watched her patience from across the room and understood it as the most dangerous thing in the space, which was saying something in a room full of dangerous things. Edmund was near the window. He was speaking with Lord Cavendish about something that had nothing to do with anything. And he did not look at Eleanor, and she did not look at him. And she was acutely aware of exactly where he was in the room without looking. Lady Wells moved to the center of the room at 20 minutes past 9. It was skillfully done. A word to a footman, a pause for attention, and then the particular kind of statement that masquerades as conversation. Lord Cavendish, I wonder if you might permit me a brief word on a matter of some concern. The room quieted in the way rooms quiet when the person speaking has the correct frequency of authority. Lord Cavendish, who was 60 and had not yet understood what was happening, made a gesture of permission. Lady Wells produced the papers. She presented the attachment instrument first, which was tidy and thorough, and cited statutes arranged to be irrefutable to anyone unfamiliar with their origins. She presented the summary of the charge against Charles Ravenscroft II, which was worse because it was detailed and specific and contained dates that gave it the texture of fact. She did it with the manner of a woman performing a civic duty that pained her, which was the most effective possible manner. And then she turned to Eleanor. "I regret," she said, "that the Earl's household arrangements have complicated this matter further. Miss Paget was dismissed from this household in the spring, as many of you may know. She is the governess he pensioned off, and she has returned under circumstances that do not reflect well on the dignity of this house or this company." The room's attention moved to Eleanor. She felt it as a physical weight. Edmund was very still by the window. He was still because he was protecting his brother's memory, which Eleanor understood now, and which made his stillness the most costly thing she had ever watched a person produce. He would not speak. He would not defend himself against the charge about Charles, because speaking meant confirming the charge existed, and confirming the charge existed meant the name of a dead man who had been innocent was destroyed in public. And he had chosen to bear the instrument rather than let that happen. Lady Wells was watching him with the satisfaction of a woman who has correctly identified what a man will sacrifice. Miss Cecily Vane said, from a point just behind her aunt, in a low voice clearly intended to be heard, "The governess he kept. How remarkable that she has come back." It was the third time. The room absorbed it. Eleanor stood and did not move, and the silence around her had a particular quality that she recognized from being 11 years old and understanding for the first time that the world had decided something about her that was not true and intended to act on it regardless. She excused herself. She went into the corridor, where it was cold and empty, and the candles were far apart. And she stood for a moment with one hand against the wall and breathed. And then she reached into her coat pocket, and she found the leaf. It was smaller than she remembered. It had dried and pressed in the 6 months since the library at Ashmore, and it was fragile in the way of preserved things that have managed to remain themselves despite being reduced. She held it in her palm and looked at it, and thought about what Edmund was doing in that room, which was bearing an injustice in silence to protect a dead man, and she thought about what she had in her reticule, which was a document Mr. Fane had delivered that morning, with the careful expression of a man transferring a weight he had been carrying too long. She thought about what courage means. She went back in. The room had not quite recovered its conversational surface when she re-entered. Lady Wells was still speaking, still arranging her papers, still directing Lord Cavendish's attention toward the attachment's procedural requirements, and the particular silence of 30 people who do not yet know what to do with what they have witnessed was still making the air heavy. Eleanor crossed to Mr. Fane. He was near the back of the room, where she had told him to position himself that morning, and he looked at her with the expression of a man who has made a decision and intends to stand in it, regardless of how it feels. He was 60 and gray-haired, and he had administered 3 estates in his professional life, and he had known for 11 years that the transfer document in his safe had been the seed of Clara Ravenscroft's death, and he had not spoken because he had not known what speech would accomplish, and because he was afraid. And he had spent 11 years understanding that this made him a coward of a particular quiet kind. He handed her the document. It was the original. Clara had not found it in Edmund's father's papers. Clara had found a copy, which Fane had made because he suspected what the original meant. The original had stayed in Fane's safe, and Fane had stayed silent. and Edmund had spent 11 years believing the original was lost. Eleanor said, in a voice that carried clearly because she was standing in a room whose acoustics were very good, and because she had decided not to be quiet. Lord Cavendish. The room turned. Lady Wells turned. I believe this document precedes the instrument Lady Wells has presented, Eleanor said, and she crossed to Lord Cavendish and gave him the paper. The transfer it describes was recorded 3 years before the charge against Charles Ravenscroft was constructed. The attachment instrument Lady Wells has shown you tonight cites Charles Ravenscroft's alleged action as its legal ground. If the ground precedes the action it supposedly documents, the instrument has no foundation. Lord Cavendish was 60 and bewildered, but he was not stupid. He read the document. He read it again. His face went very careful. Lady Wells said, that document is not authenticated. The girl has produced a forgery. Mr. Fane, Eleanor said. Fane stepped forward. He named himself, and his firm, and his 30 years of practice, and his connection to the Ravenscroft estate. And he said, in the dry, precise tone of a man whose professional voice had carried more weight than his personal conscience, and who intended to correct that imbalance tonight, that the document was his original, and he would attest to it under any examination the company cared to require. Lady Wells looked at him. Something moved through her face. The first thing Eleanor had seen move through it that was not deliberate. The room was very quiet. Edmund crossed it. He did not hurry. He moved in the measured way of a man who has made a decision and sees no reason to announce it before he has arrived at its destination. He crossed from the window to the place beside Eleanor, where the light was direct. And Lord Cavendish and 30 other witnesses had an unobstructed view. And he stood there, and he looked at Eleanor, and then he looked at the room. Miss Paget came back, he said. His voice was level and clear, and it reached the back of the room without difficulty. I intend to make that impossible to regret. Lady Wells said nothing. Her mouth opened and then closed, and for a moment her face was the face of a woman whose script has reached a line it did not contain and has no instruction for what follows. Then it settled, carefully, into something that was at least the shape of composure. A temporary composure. The sort that holds for a carriage ride home and no further. Miss Cecily Vane looked at her aunt, and then at Edmund, and then at Eleanor, and her expression underwent a specific and quiet revision. The revision of a woman who has been told all her life that she is the correct answer and has just encountered a question her answer does not fit. Lord Cavendish said, to Lady Wells, in a tone of great restraint, I think we will need to examine this matter rather more carefully before the end of the evening. Edmund's hand came to Eleanor's elbow. His fingers were warm through the sleeve of her blue silk and entirely steady. And she was aware of the warmth in the particular way of a body that has been cataloging warmth as evidence for a long time, and has finally been given something to confirm. Come, he said. You have done enough for this evening. She had not, she thought. She had only just begun. But she went with him, because his hand was at her elbow, and the room was behind them, and the corridor was ahead. And she was allowed for the first time in 6 months to be moving in the right direction. Ashmore in November was different from Ashmore in spring, which she had expected, and different from what she had imagined in the 6 months between, which she had not expected to be wrong about. She had imagined it gray and contracted, winter pressing on the house from all sides. What she found was that the house was warmer than she remembered, which Mrs. Holt attributed to a new arrangement of the fireplaces, and which Eleanor attributed to something else, something she did not yet have the precise word for. She stayed for 3 weeks because there was business to conclude, and because Edmund asked her to stay, and she had, apparently, reached the limit of the amount of refusal she was willing to perform on his behalf. Mr. Fane came twice more. There was correspondence with a senior peer whose response arrived in time to be read aloud to Edmund by the fire on the second Tuesday, which was a specific pleasure she had not anticipated, and then catalogued. Thomas was 11 now, which he pointed out on the fifth day with the air of someone delivering important intelligence. He showed her the progress of his natural history project, which had expanded to include diagrams of creatures he had invented and presented alongside the authentic ones, without indicating which was which, and Eleanor identified the invented ones and told him they were also worth recording, because imagination was a form of observation. Thomas considered this and seemed satisfied. Edmund was in the doorway when she said it. She was not surprised. The library was cold in the mornings and warmer by noon, and she had returned to her Tuesday practice of reading in the early hour before the household was fully occupied, which she had resumed without asking permission and which Edmund had not commented on. On the second Tuesday, she found a copper beech leaf pressed and placed inside the agricultural correspondence, in the precise position where she sat. She took it out and held it alongside her own, and looked at the two of them for a long moment. The leaves were from the same tree. She could see that from the shape of the lobing. He had pressed it at some point she could not identify and placed it there, which meant he had known where she sat and why, and had done something precise and careful, and absolutely without announcement. She placed her leaf down beside his and sat for a long time in the quiet of the library with the two small brown things in front of her and the November light on the floor. Edmund appeared in the doorway at 20 minutes past 9, which was the time he always appeared when the library was occupied by someone he intended to find. "Eleanor," he said. It was the first time. She knew it was the first time because she had been waiting for it in the way a person waits for a particular room door to open after a long time in the corridor. He said it the way he said all the things that mattered, which was quietly, and once and with no preparation and no decoration. And it arrived in her, with the simple force of a thing that has been true for a long time, and has finally been said in the open air. She turned in the chair. He came to the chair. He stood before her, and he reached out and took her hand, which he held in both of his and did not yet do anything further with, because he was a man who understood that a thing worth having was worth arriving at in the correct order. "I am going to ask you something," he said. "I know," she said. "You do not know what it is." "I know what it is," she said. And she did. And she could see in his face that he knew she knew, and that this was something he found, privately and without display, acceptable. Thomas played the piano in the next room, the same 4 bars of a simple air repeated with absolute confidence in their eventual improvement. Snow had begun an hour ago, and was still falling in the particular soft way of early November snow that intends to stay. Eleanor looked at the 2 leaves on the desk beside her, the hers and the his, pressed and placed 6 months apart from the same copper beech in the library where she had been sitting when he had first stopped in the doorway and decided to come in anyway. She said yes. The snow fell. The fire held. The music went on. "Thank you for staying until the end. If Eleanor's return moved you, a word below would carry." She would not have thought to ask.